All right, everyone, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. I want to say welcome to the Hughes Symposium here today. My name is John Kern. I am Assistant Professor of Great Books and Religion, and I teach in both the Humanities and Teacher Education Division, as well as the Religion Division. I'm also right now the coordinator of the Hughes Symposium, and that's what this event is. It's a biannual presentation and celebration of scholarship in the Hughes Division, this time also celebrating an ISL. I first want to thank Stella Herbs and Lee Jackson. Lee helped to bring the food and the snacks over there, and feel free to grab refreshments whenever you would like. So I want to thank them for their help with this event. I want to thank Rachel Gold, who helped me to sort of transition into the role. And I also want to give a shout out to Pepperdine Libraries, who is a co-sponsor of this event. I want to thank especially Jeff Bowen and Dean Rusa and the team for helping to put this all together, the attentiveness they gave to the event. You're all so good at what you do. They did the flyer that went out in the summarium, as well as the poster that we have posted various places. So I want to thank them. And we appreciate the partnership. So to move to the book talks themselves, I'll start with just giving some housekeeping. We'll basically have two 30-minute talks, each one followed by about 15 minutes of Q&A. So write down your questions, keep them at the ready. We'll have lots of time for discussion. Our first presenter is Martin Premoli in the Humanities and Teacher Education Division. He is Assistant Professor of English, and his book that he'll be telling us about today is Global Fictions and Environmental Disaster: Imagining Survival on Our Changing Planet. Let's give a congratulations to Martin for his book.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for being here. Can you all hear me okay? Okay, great. So I too wanted to begin by saying thank you to the Pepperdine Library and to the Hughes Division for hosting the symposium. Specifically, thanks to John and Jeff for coordinating the event. I also wanted to say thanks to Kelly for brainstorming the joint book talk idea with me. And finally, I wanted to offer thanks to our Lord for creating such a beautiful world and for emphasizing in his word the importance of caring for his creation. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and get started. Over the past years, as I've researched and written this project, our planet has continued to suffer a cascade of environmental disasters of unprecedented scale and frequency. In 2021, catastrophic flooding devastated parts of Germany and China, displacing thousands. That same year, the Pacific Northwest experienced a record-breaking heat dome, with temperatures soaring above 115 degrees Fahrenheit in regions unaccustomed to extreme heat. In 2022 and 2023, Pakistan has endured its worst flooding in recorded history, submerging a third of the country and displacing over 30 million people. But as you all know, we don't need to look externally to encounter such experiences, as last year's Franklin and Palisades fires have made tragically clear. These disasters, each with their own local contexts and consequences, together testify to the escalating instability of the planet's Earth systems. They are not isolated events, but symptoms of a global crisis that continues to accelerate, deepen, and disproportionately impact the most vulnerable communities and ecosystems. My book, Global Fictions and Environmental Disaster, examines environmental calamities like these, exploring how literary studies might help us conceptualize and contend with environmental catastrophe today. To do so, my book undertakes three primary endeavors. These are the three main goals here. First, as my opening account suggests, anthropogenic climate change has reshaped the frequency, scale, and intensity of seemingly natural disasters. My project considers how notions of progress intersect with and amplify the category of natural disaster. This reorientation enables us to see that environmental disasters cannot be understood as natural any longer, a term that is still so often used. Instead, I developed the term abnatural disaster which draws upon the etymological versatility of the prefix ab, meaning both away from and derived from. This term helps us understand environmental disasters as dynamic, interactive phenomena co-created by systems of weather and by human subjects. The second related claim of my project argues that the novel can be understood as an incredibly powerful vision of a climate model, one which helps us imagine the complexity of environmental disaster today. As an alternative climate model, the novel, along with its formal attributes, allows us to grasp relations between the geological, meteorological, and social factors that make up climate. This ability is particularly important within the context of environmental change, a phenomenon of dizzying complexity which extends across far-flung scales of space and time. With the novel's ability to link monumental shifts in time and its capacity for traversing disparate spaces, the novel can convincingly simulate and complicate both the intimate details and general contours of our increasingly warming world. Finally, at the heart of this project is my investment in addressing one of the central tensions of Anthropocene discourse. And for those who aren't familiar with that term, Anthropocene is a term that's been proposed by the scientific community to acknowledge a new geological epoch in which humans are the primary actors on the planet's Earth systems, basically. So on the one hand, the Anthropocene is meant to index a collective story regarding humankind's impact on the Earth and its geophysical systems. This perspective emphasizes environmental change as a global dilemma caused by the human species writ large. On the other hand, the Anthropocene tells a narrative of fracture, chronicling the widening disparities between the world's wealthiest and poorest populations. The narrative of fracture highlights the various ways in which environmental violence is disproportionately created and differentially distributed. Thus, the Anthropocene, as Rob Nixon tells it, seeks to tell two large stories that can often seem in tension with one another. So is it a global story, or is it a story in which minority communities are most severely impacted? In an attempt to navigate this tension, critical investigations have often privileged one vantage over the other, unfortunately reducing the complexity of this dilemma. My research embraces and explores this important point of contention through examinations of contemporary narrative fiction about environmental disaster. I develop and employ a north-south comparative approach, pairing novels from the global north with novels from the global south. This framework my book illustrates allows us to attend to both the global and uneven dimensions of environmental crisis. It does so in ways that seek to be generative and revelatory rather than divisive. The book consists of 4 chapters and a coda. Each chapter focuses on a specific manifestation of environmental disaster. So in my first chapter, I pair Jesmyn Ward's novel Salvage the Bones with Monique Rafi's novel Archipelago. You can see the places underneath the titles as well where these authors are writing from. These 2 books model the complex temporalities of hurricanes, dislocating them from their typical associations with the swiftness of punctual violence. Turning towards the category of drought, my second chapter examines The Water Knife by Paolo Bacigalupi and The Swan Book by Alexis Wright. I argue that these books tap into the scalar versatility of the Bildungsroman to communicate the developmental dynamics that lead to and exacerbate conditions of drought. My third chapter addresses the topic of mass species extinction, examining Linda Hogan's Power and Henrietta Rosenes's Green Line. Both novels craft a new literary technique which dramatizes the ripple effects of keystone species extinction. Chapter 4 tackles the issue of agricultural disaster in the globalized agricultural sector by analyzing Ruth Ozecki's All Over Creation and Sonora Jaw's Foreign. These novels examine the negative impacts of the green and gene revolutions on small rural farmers and envision innovative forms of eco-activism in response to agricultural collapse. Together, these chapters suggest that in our heightened age of global ecological precarity, literary studies can be a useful tool for engaging with questions of globality, ecology, and environmental stewardship. To illustrate the way that my book works, my talk today is going to draw on the third chapter of my book, which spotlights issues of mass species extinction and conservation. So across disciplines, scholars have observed that we are presently in the midst of a global mass extinction event, otherwise referred to as the Holocene extinction. Previously, our Earth has experienced 5 mass extinction events dating as far back as 440 million years ago. Each of these events has wiped out, according to scientific analysis, more than 60% of life on the planet. In defining mass extinction events, researchers have argued that these events share 3 common characteristics. Firstly, mass extinction events are necessarily global in scope, so they're not constrained by local or regional parameters. Secondly, they occur when extinction rates rise significantly above levels of extinction. So the rate at which new species come into being is lower than the rate at which species are dying out. And finally, within a geological framework, these events occur across a geologically short period of time. This is only short from a geological perspective. It could be thousands of years from a human perspective. Unlike the past 5 extinction events, which are believed to have been caused by asteroid strikes, volcanic eruptions, and natural climate shifts, our present crisis is the first to have a human origin point. Right now, Elizabeth Colbert writes in her study on the topic, we are deciding without quite meaning to which evolutionary pathways will remain open and which will forever be closed. No other creature has ever managed this, and it will unfortunately be our most enduring legacy. Recently, we've witnessed a flourishing of cultural production, including film, photography, visual art, fiction, and theater that sets out to tackle the problem of species extinction, or at least bring attention to it. In her culturally inflected approach to extinction studies, Ursula Heise imagines a range of such cultural objects and trends focused on species decline, tracing how they help us grapple with the scale and complexity of the extinction crisis. Here's an image of her book. Through her readings, Heise expounds upon the usage and value of literary forms and genres, each employed by writers to communicate a particular ecological issue or cause for environmentalist agendas. Building on her work, this chapter identifies and theorizes a frequently employed, yet critically overlooked narrative structure used to represent biodiversity loss. This is what I call trophic cascade implotment. Through an analysis of Linda Hogan's novel Power, so I'm only focusing on the first half of my chapter for the talk. I explore how this narrative mode depicts the loss of a keystone species, triggering a chain of ecological, cultural, and affective repercussions. In doing so, the novel attunes readers to the intricate interdependencies that define ecological systems and the far-reaching consequences of disrupting them. Power centers on the killing of a Florida panther, a keystone species and sacred animal for indigenous communities, to jumpstart reflection on whether extinction marks the end of a life form or the end of a form of living, particularly in the context of Western modernity. So this section of my chapter argues that Hogan does not simply mirror the scientific model of the trophic cascade, but rather amplifies it and reconfigures it to explore the layered, often unpredictable ramifications of species loss. Crucially, the novel's engagement with indigenous cosmologies challenges dominant Euro-Western ecological frameworks and underscores the importance of fostering dialogue between divergent, at times conflicting views of environmental stewardship. Before illustrating how this plays out within her novel, I'd like to briefly spend a couple minutes unpacking the idea of the trophic cascade, a term that I've now mentioned a few times. In 1949, the well-known writer, ecologist, and forester Aldo Leopold composed a Sand County Almanac. This hugely influential book consists of numerous essays that explore questions of conservation, environmental politics, modernization, and ecological philosophy. Of the various essays published in his book, the seminal Thinking Like a Mountain is perhaps the most widely known. In this essay, Leopold recounts going on a hunting trip with a group of friends in Idaho. Their objective in this hunt was to exterminate a local wolf population so that the deer population could in turn multiply. At the moment in which Leopold and his hunting partner confront and kill a mother wolf, however, he experiences a sort of revelation. He says, just as the deer herd lives in mortal fear of its wolves, so does a mountain live in mortal fear of its deer. Through this understanding, Leopold begins to tease out the ripple effects of what, through his work, would come to be known as the trophic cascade, which is an ecological phenomenon triggered by the addition or removal of top predators and involving reciprocal changes in the relative populations of predator and prey through a food chain. In other words, the trophic cascade describes the knockoff effects of removing top predators like wolves from food webs. I think the example a lot of us might have heard of was the reintroduction of the wolf population in Yellowstone. Leopold later goes on to more fully unpack this understanding through his description of how the wolf's extermination leads to unexpected consequences for the mountain's ecosystem. And I'll share his quote here. Taking these insights into account, this chapter examines how novelists have taken up and creatively adapted the ecological model of the trophic cascade to dramatize the repercussions faced by particular communities. So with this in mind, I'm now going to turn to the narrative case study, which I'll be discussing, applying this framework to, which is Power by Linda Hogan. Linda Hogan, born in the Chickasaw Nation, was born in 1947 in Denver, Colorado. A poet, novelist, and memoirist, Hogan is often identified as one of the most prominent voices in contemporary Native American literature. She began writing in the 1970s, establishing herself as a keen chronicler of Indigenous traditions, Native American responses to settler colonial violence, and perhaps most relevant for this chapter, Indigenous relations to land. In Power, the novel Power follows Omishto, a 16-year-old girl torn between the modern world and her taiga heritage, as she witnesses her Aunt Ama kill a Florida panther, an act that is both illegal yet spiritually significant. The novel explores the tensions between Indigenous traditions and US law, particularly in relation to environmental ethics and questions of sovereignty. As Omishto navigates the aftermath of this killing, she undergoes a personal transformation, questioning her identity, loyalties, and the meaning of power. To elaborate on the novel's usage of the trophic cascade emplotment, it's useful to delve more deeply into Power's depiction of the Florida panther and its role and relationship with the ecosystem of the Florida Everglades. The Florida panther is a unique cougar subspecies of medium size that lives in pinelands, tropical hardwood hammocks, and mixed freshwater swamp forests. A carnivore, often living in solitude, the panther's diet consists both of small mammals and small creatures and birds. In 1973, the Florida panther was added to the IUCN Endangered Species List, which is the national list that monitors the sort of levels of certain species. And this endangered status was a result of southern Florida's increasing development and urbanization, which adversely affected the panther. At the time that the list was released, it was estimated that about 20 panthers remained in the wild. Since then, as of last year, conservationists estimate that the numbers have risen to approximately 230. So the population's bouncing back a little bit. Efforts to protect and revive the Florida panther population have received significant attention in part because of the panther's ecological significance. It acts as a flagship and keystone species. As a keystone species, the Florida panther protects many other plants and animals, that live there. Situated at the top of its food chain, these cats help keep ecosystems in check. However, because they inhabit such key ecological positions, their diminishment has also led to unintended ecological consequences, as is indexed by the trophic cascade. So at first glance, the cascading consequences of the panther's death in the novel are persuasively replicated by the author. On the level of plot, the novel reproduces the ripple effects of the trophic cascade by beginning its narrative with the death of the Florida panther, which takes place in the first third of the novel. Because of this narrative structure, all subsequent events in the novel are read in light of this moment. After the panther's death, for example, Hogan mentions how panther elimination has contributed to the escalation of deer populations in the Everglades. The increase in the deer's population, in turn, results in the stripping of the region's flora, which comes about as a result of local deer populations consuming plants without any kind of restriction. Without sufficient plant life, the region where the novel takes place experiences severe flooding. This too is chronicled in the book. After the hurricane, Omishto, our protagonist, notes, the strong winds had blown water all across the land. There are no edges, no borders between elements because everything is water, silver, and glassy. As the sequence of events depicts, the novel's plot unfolds, at least initially, in a way that replicates the hierarchical structure of the trophic cascade. The narrative vividly illustrates the ecological impact of a keystone species being displaced from its crucial node in a food web. My interest, however, pertains more so to the ways that the novel borrows and then reconfigures and amplifies the logic of the trophic cascade in order to communicate the unexpected repercussions of species loss, leading to what I've termed the trophic cascade implotment. One of the central ways that Hogan's novel disrupts the typical structure of the trophic cascade is through its deliberate extension of the panther's of the panther's death, the moment that typically triggers an ecological breakdown. In Power, the death of the Florida panther stretches on for nearly 10 pages. The scene begins with an extended description of Ama tracking the panther for miles through thick foliage. When Ama finally encounters and shoots the panther, the narrative further slows to describe its corpse, Ama's response, and Omishto's reaction to the events. By slowing this moment to such a radical degree, Hogan creates space for reflection on the panther's death, allowing readers to see that the panther was dying long before its encounter with Ama. As the witness to this event, Omishto acts as our focal point to this understanding. While observing the panther's last moments, for instance, she comments, quote, that sugarcane and cattle and white houses with red roofs had killed the panther and the panther people even before the storm. They are the true violators, end quote. Her reference draws attention to the larger issues of development that have disrupted lifeways of the Florida panther, inserting these concerns into the ecological model of the trophic cascade. Moreover, Omishto also comments on the panther's ill health. She says, the panther has broken teeth and fleas and ticks that are still escaping the lifeless body. I can see its ribs. Around the neck, the fur's all flattened and it looks nearly gone, worn away. Omishto's diagnostic description points to the various environmental and health issues, such as pollution and inbreeding, that plague the remaining Florida panther community. And it raises questions as to whether a sickened, diminished population can actually reproduce in order to escape its critically endangered status. Both these insights destabilize our initial understanding of Ama as the panther's killer, suggesting that the actual culprit is the slow violence of Florida's urban development. The novel's rearticulation of the ecological model thus forces readers to reflect on what, why, and how an apex predator is removed from a trophic system, questions that lead us to different understandings of environmental violence and its ecological consequences. Perhaps the most profound alteration to the trophic cascade, however, comes through the novel's explanation that the panther, according to taiga worldview. And taiga is the fictional name for the indigenous tribe that the protagonist belongs to. So that the panther, according to taiga worldview, is not just an endangered species, which would be a classification that adheres to Euro-Western scientific standards and practices, but a sacred cosmological being. With this difference in mind, it becomes clear that Panther also urges its readers to consider the following implied questions. What does it mean when a cosmological figure is pushed to the edge of extinction? And moreover, what epistemological modes and aesthetic practices are most adept at addressing this possibility? To attend to these questions, it might be useful to map out the specifics of the panther as a sacred being for the Taiga people. We first learn of the panther's status when Omishto reviews the Taiga clan story of the Panther Woman, which it's quite long, so I'm just projecting it here. But essentially, it's the story of how their earth came into being, which was through the collaborative work of Panther Woman and a panther. So the panther is central to the origin story of that community. Firstly, this story illuminates the relational kinship structures between humans and non-humans that animate and undergird taiga culture. Writing about indigenous communities in the US, indigenous scholar Kyle Powys-White has explained that indigenous kinship networks include a sense of identity that is associated with the environment and a sense of responsibility to care for the environment. There's no privileging of humans as unique in having agency or intelligence, so one's identity and caretaking responsibility as a human includes the philosophy that non-humans have their own agency, spirituality, knowledge, and intelligence. Thus, humans ought to take responsibility to be respectful of non-human ways of living and flourishing. Omishto's account of this creation story, which focuses on the interconnectedness of life, suggests that such views are central to taiga belief systems. The story of Panther Woman outlines the kinship systems that are central to their culture, assisting readers in understanding the significance that an animal like a panther might have for their community. As we see in Omishto's account, the panther is just as agential as the Panther Woman, if not more so, for the panther is the one who decides to be sacrificed in order to traverse and save their worlds. This cosmological narrative, or origin story, underscores the Taiga clan's kinship networks while presenting the panther for Omishto and her community as what anthropologist Marisol de la Cadena terms an earth being. Such entities, including mountains, rivers, animals, exist outside the ontological categories of modern Western thought, blurring the divide between nature and humanity. From an indigenous perspective, these beings are sacred presences with agency and relational power, exposing the limits of human-centered ecological and political frameworks. In power, the panther acts as such an earth being. Its presence opens up a space for a dialogue between conflicting cosmologies, one's rooted in Western legal and ecological frameworks, and another grounded in indigenous relational ethics. The panther embodies this cosmopolitical principle, mediating between Western and indigenous worldviews and dramatizing these tensions for the reader. It also asks us to consider what might it be like to live in a world where both worldviews can meet. Equipped with this cultural understanding of the panther's importance as a kin and as an earth being, we can begin to comprehend how the panther acts not only as a keystone species for the Florida Everglades system, but as a cultural and ontological keystone, structuring taiga worldview in foundational and inextricable ways. Understanding the panther in this way raises crucial implication for Western ecological frameworks to contend with. For if the panther is not just a keystone species, but a sacred being, then the panther's elimination not only affects the ecosystem of the Florida Everglades, but it also extends into and threatens taiga worldviews and ways of living. The story speaks to this possibility by observing that Panther Woman and the panther work together to refresh our thoughts and renew our actions. They are both central to the cultural vitality of the taiga community and cornerstones of their belief systems. This insight draws our attention to the distinctly real ways in which the decimation of a particular species can undermine the continuity and identity of human groups whose integrity derives from their relations with these other beings. In this sense, the extinction of non-humans may negate particular possibilities of being human or of being part of a community. Their relationships are bound together. The indirect consequences that comprise the trophic cascade, in other words, stretch far beyond its common parameters. Through her writing, therefore, Hogan shows how the logic of the trophic cascade might be adopted and amplified to incorporate a deeply complex understanding of both ecological and social loss. So in Imagining Extinction, the book that I started talking about at the beginning of this talk, Ursula Heise argues that narrative plays a critical role in making the scale and stakes of biodiversity loss comprehensible, particularly for environmentalist audiences seeking to mobilize care, action, and ethical responsibility. Literature for Heise does not merely reflect the reality of species extinction, but offers structures through which the meaning of extinction is imagined, contested, and made emotionally and politically legible. Hogan's power exemplifies this narrativizing function. Through its deployment of what I've termed trophic cascade emplotment, the novel dramatizes how the loss of a keystone species reverberates not only through ecological systems, but also through social and cultural frameworks. In foregrounding the Florida panther as both an ecological keystone and an Earth being central to indigenous worldviews, power expands the scope of what is at stake in extinction, refusing the reduction of endangered species to metrics or resources within a scientific register. Ultimately, then, power asks readers to reconsider what ethical and effective terms through which extinction is apprehended. By amplifying the trophic cascade into a broader mediation on relational loss, Hogan offers a powerful counter-narrative to dominant extinction discourses, one that is rooted in alternative epistemologies and resistant to the instrumental logics of certain strands of environmentalism. In doing so, the novel offers not only a critique of the forces driving the sixth extinction, but also a template for reimagining kinship, care, and coexistence in our changing world. How we tell the story of extinction deeply shapes how we respond to it. And Power tells a story that is both a warning and a call for expanded forms of environmental stewardship. Thank you.
So we have about 15 minutes for questions. We got some questions. Thanks, Martin. Thanks, Martin.
An obnoxious question.
Go for it.
Does it work?
Which part?
Does the imagination in these novels produce any actual change? And I'm thinking about maybe whether you've considered or thought about readership at all and who's reading these novels, whether the people that are reading the novels might already be thinking in this sort of imaginative ways before encountering the novels, whether the people might encounter these novels and actually change their mind, or maybe say it differently. Is the real work the work of putting together the narrative? Is the real work the work of the author? So yeah, I don't know. To take a step back from the really wonderful case study that you've given us, and then to ask again the obnoxious question:
Sure.
Can this change anything?
Yeah. No, it's a real question, and I think one that relates to the book overall, not just this chapter specifically or my reading, right? Like it is very much a question of what can art do to change the way that we engage with the planet, our views on environmental issues, what political effect does it have? I think that's a real question and a valid one. I never view art as I never view the reason for art doing what it does to be to kind of cause a mass political change. I think that would be unrealistic. But what I do think it can do is prompt small scale change on an individual case by case basis. And I do think those things will ultimately add up, especially with this topic relating to extinction. I mean, how many people here even know that we are in a mass extinction event according to the scientific community? Like, were there people, like maybe a few hands? So hopefully my talk has now informed you of that for those who weren't aware of that before. So I don't think that artwork's role, and I don't expect it to cause these massive shifts in our politics or legal frameworks. But I do think that on a small case by case basis, it can awaken people to issues. And that's all I really ask from it.
Thank you, Martin. I actually had a very similar question, so I want to get this out here before you've moved too far off of this. I really liked what you said about how the panther is a keystone, and you had that wonderful slide about it's a cultural and ontological one for the taiga worldview. And so I was thinking when you were talking about the ways that like we can have differences come together in these novels, what about the Western world? Is there a text that you have in your study that you've done that can help someone who comes out of the US, particularly our concrete jungles here in the US, to recognize our interconnectedness with nature? Because I mean, that's what I was thinking about, that if you like, perhaps for someone who's part of the taiga culture, that seems very self-evident, but I've had students I've heard walking across campus who are like, it's a squirrel, I've never seen one before. And so I'm thinking like, how do we try to rescue that disconnect for someone who is already so disconnected? And do you have novel examples that maybe invite someone who's Western to see that?
Yeah. So the counterpart to this novel that I do the sort of comparative reading with is set in an urban setting. It's set in Cape Town, South Africa, which is a very green city that has a lot of its nature woven into the fabric of the sort of urban structure. But that novel is focused on a species that has already gone extinct, which is the Cape lion. And so the novel is basically about how do you act as an environmentalist when the species that you're interested in has already disappeared, it's already vanished. And so I think through that reading, which is more so about how storytelling can be a mode of conservation, right? We tell stories about animals, and in that sense, we kind of keep them alive through storytelling. I think a similar thing can be done here for students here by, at least that's what I attempt to do in my classes, is share stories. I think, Green Lion is one example of this, but there are lots of different examples of sort of climate fiction or green fiction that takes place in an urban setting that really reconfigures and sort of blurs the distinction between like nature, culture, nature, city. Like the city is the city is a natural environment as well, right? Like the green parrots that we see all over LA come from Mexico, and they are flourishing here. So there's small examples within the ecosystems that we can look at that I think do a nice job of having us think about, oh, actually cities are habitats. It's not that cities are like separate from the environment. They're just a different kind of environment.
Thank you so much. My first question is directed at that idea that you said of like the Western modern divorcing from the and almost anthropomorphizing of nature. And I wonder, in your study, did you find a place where that had occurred? And do you have a theory of why there was an inflection? Because when I think there's like Old Man River and the belief that Tolkien wrote about his mythologizing of a world with all of these things is the world of yesterday, and now it's a world without that mythology, and it's a world of modernity. And is there room for it? Can we bring that back? And then on the other side too, the question of the wolves in particular, I'm thinking of the current fight between ranchers and conservationists. And you have competing visions, if we're looking at our own context institutionally within Christianity, of one side saying, no, no, we need to conserve and protect and bring a Garden of Eden, and then the other side saying, no, no, God gave us dominion over, and therefore we can and should protect our herds. So I wonder if you have thoughts on those.
Sure. Yeah. So I'll start with the first part. I think some of the flashpoints historically that people talk about that are seen to be sort of a shift in our mindset around our relationship with nature, some that are often cited are like colonial America, right, where we had to reshape the land and illustrate kind of ownership over the land by reshaping it. So this kind of Jeffersonian or Lockean relationship with the land where you take ownership of the land by working it. And that's in very, very distinct contrast to indigenous worldviews or views on the land, which view land as not something that you can ever own. It's inalienable, right? Like it can never be separated from you. You are in a relationship with the land. So I think, at least in this chapter, a lot of what I'm interested in comes from those two like competing views. Which stems from like an early American view of land as something that you can own, you can work. It's a resource, right, that can help you survive, essentially. Did that kind of respond to that first part of the question? And then for the second part, just to refresh my memory, you were asking about like a competing perspective on land as like.
So that tension on you have those competing almost mythologies around a thing, and in our context, Christian, but I think
Yeah,
see that like
they are
mythologies.
competing, but they're also not. Like I do think that a lot of my passion for environmentalism comes from viewing the earth as God's creation. And that's why even though this talk largely focused on indigenous worldviews and belief systems, I wanted to start by having a moment of thanks to God for creating our planet, because I think they are aligned, and there are places in the Bible where we do see that relationship and views of nature as being something that we're kind of in a reciprocal relationship with, very much present. So I actually don't see them as conflicting. I view it very much as part of what God's design is for us and how he views like the responsibility that we should have for his creation.
The interesting thing that you brought up about creatures having these very outsized importances to us. I was thinking a little bit more about celebrity importance, such as mountain lion P22.
Yeah.
That is probably the most famous wild animal in Southern California. May he rest in peace. Or also Harambe the gorilla, who was shot in that zoo. We ascribe a lot of human characteristics to these animals. They have an outsized role in culture. And I was wondering if beyond the novel, there's an area where you see the stories of animals. They take on human characteristics. We sell merchandise for them, hats and T-shirts that say P22 on them, or a picture of Harambe. I'm wondering if you have thought about maybe some of those sorts of animals and their outsized importance in culture.
Yeah, that's a good question. Definitely, that's actually a very lively topic of debate within extinction studies, this kind of interdisciplinary field that's focused on this topic. Because what you're describing is often referred to as like charismatic megafauna. So animals like elephants or rhinos or lions or monarch butterflies or polar bears, right? We've all seen like the Coke or Pepsi commercials or whatever with the polar bear. They just have a lot of appeal to us because they're so unusual, or because they relate to us in some way. They have perhaps like human qualities, or human like sort of a kind of intelligence that we can sort of relate to. So a lot of conservation movements tend to latch on to those kinds of species because they are very exciting for larger audiences, right? We all get excited about seeing like an orca whale, right? They're really impressive. Um, in more of my writing on extinction, I tend to not look at those animals just because they tend to be the ones that already are getting a lot of attention. And so it becomes a question of, do we only save these really cool animals, or do we save like mushrooms that are equally important for ecosystems but aren't getting as much attention? So it does become a question of like which animals are captivating and how, when we talk about extinction, do we use them and for what reason? I think I tend to not focus on them because a lot of other people are writing about those species, whereas there are other equally important species for ecosystems that just don't get attended to or don't get as much acknowledgement. Yeah.
All right, let's all give Martin a round of applause. Thank you, Martin, for these fascinating reflections. All right, yes, welcome to newcomers. So our second book talk is going to be from Kelly Marshall, professor of French in the International Studies and Languages Division. Her recent co-written work is entitled Teachers as Mediators in Language Immersion Education, Navigating Ideologies, Cultures, and Identities. Let's give a warm congrats and welcome to Kelly.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay, wonderful. First of all, I would like to thank John Kern and the Hute Division for inviting me to be a co-speaker at the Hute Symposium. As it turns out, this book is on teacher education ultimately, and so it fits really well within their scope of their division, though I am in international studies and teach French. My co-author, I had with on the title slide, but I just put and because everything that I do was done by Wendy as well in some way or another. A lot of these slides were developed for other conferences, and I'll tell a bit more about our story in a moment. How do you? Oh, wait, got it. Okay. So I have a couple of, well, they could be brief discussion questions, reflection questions. It depends on what your mood is, but and some of my students will be like, oh no, here we go again. Yeah. How would you be different today if you didn't speak English? How would your life be different? How would the people that you know be different? What sorts of things would you do or not do if you spoke or didn't speak English? So think about that. What about another language, if any? My second language is French. I speak a little bit of Spanish. My colleague over here, Pietro, can speak Italian as mother tongue, yeah. And so it's all of these kind of questions come into play in this book. So would you be different if you didn't speak that language? Would the experiences in your life be different? Would you have engagement with different opportunities or people, education, whatnot? Then what is one thing that you learned from a person from another culture that changed your perspective on something or someone? Usually when you encounter people, even from different cultures within the same society, you're going to find out that there are things that you learn from them that you wouldn't have otherwise thought of. So when we think of language education, oftentimes we think, oh yes, well, all of this comes into play. But today I'm going to present a case to you in which, simply put, it didn't. So that's your teaser. But first, how did I meet Wendy, my co-author? In our book, we say it's serendipitous. When we talk about it at conferences, we say it's serendipitous. But here I can say it's a God thing. I was looking for, after I got my pre-tenure, my first 3 journal articles published, I was looking for a new research topic. I contacted my friend up at the Université de Moncton, Francophone University, and I said, you know, in New Brunswick, not everyone knows what's going on the Anglophone side of things, but it seems like when you've got this kind of society, which I'll talk about in a moment, that there are like 2 sides to the coin, and it would be interesting to know. And Annette said, well, It's funny that you mentioned that because I was coming home from the conference a month ago and I sat next to this researcher on the plane coming home from the same conference, Wendy, who had just moved back to Canada from Singapore, where she had done a great deal of research on multicultural education. She's an expert on world Englishes, on language policy, language educational policy. And so I contacted Wendy in 2014. I was up in Canada and we met, and we met at a Starbucks there in Moncton, and she was kind of like, well, I have this other grant proposal in. I'm not really sure I want to pick up new projects, but like, what are you thinking about? And she mentioned that her kids were in French immersion and that they had come from Singapore and that she had put them in the French immersion program. But she kind of noticed that there were some peculiarities. The kids were coming home, didn't really want to speak French, didn't really know anything about Francophone culture. And so we kind of just had this in the back of our minds. And that has led to an 11-year research partnership. So here's the timeline, just for fun. We met in August 2014. After we decided to focus on French immersion, we found this article as we were canvassing the literature, because neither of us knew anything about it. So we just dived in and looked at everything we could find. We found an article published by a scholar whose book also inspired our book, Seaver from the University of Alberta, saying that there needed to be more socially oriented research on French immersion. In Canada, as well as in the States, most of the time the research has been on literacy rates, on language acquisition, on, okay, are students as capable of learning in math in their second language? If I say L2, that's going to be second language. So can they learn math as well in their L2 as they would in their L1? So they compare, all these kinds of educational metrics, but very few people up until that time, besides Sylvie, had looked at kind of social implications of immersion education in Canada. So Wendy and I, we canvassed the literature, we prepared our IRB, and we did our first interviews in May, June 2015, so 10 years ago. We started presenting on this research, but at the same time, Wendy we didn't have students' points of view. And so our first research was interviewing teachers and principals, which the book is principally focused on. I didn't mean that pun. Then Wendy wanted to talk to 8th graders because, it's hard to interview smaller children. They don't have a good meta-awareness. But by the time they were in 8th grade, they would have been in immersion education for 5 years. And so they would start having an idea of, why are we in this? What is it for? What do I think about speaking French? And so Wendy conducted focus groups, and then I was with her on the analysis of that data in 2016. And in the meantime, we had conferences and publications and all of these things. And then we eventually found that we wanted to put together a specialist Fulbright. I went in 2019, just after the Woolsey fire. All of this is kind of overlaying with everything that's happened here in Malibu. So there's a reason, and we say this in our preface, why it took kind of so long to get to the book. But finally, we decided to start the book proposal. I looked, our earliest files were in 2019. It was sent back to us, and we reworked it spring of 2020, and it was approved in May, June 2020. So this kind of explains why we had a slow start. And the publisher, I have to say, Martin and I, also special thanks to Martin. We figured out very early on that we had the same publisher, and so we thought it would be really fun to have like a co-book talk, because his book came out about a month before ours did. So but they've been wonderful to work with, just excellent. So they were patient. They gave us many, many, many extensions. Like, I think we had perhaps three extensions, and finally in 2024, they said, okay, this is it. You've got to get this manuscript in. So Wendy and I are also known to be accident prone. So right when we were supposed to turn the book in, I had a bit of an accident, but we got it in. Anyway, so what is the story all about? Maybe the question is, what is it not about? My graduate advisor always said that when I would get lost in my dissertation research. I don't know where I'm going. What is this about? He would say, okay, what is the story you're trying to tell? And so it gets rather complicated. Mainly, the overarching story we're trying to tell is language education is not always attached to cultural education. That is, if you're learning a language, it does not automatically mean that you will be learning a culture, even in a school system, even in the context now in language education where intercultural competence has been very much touted for like about 30 years. It can be the case that it is not emphasized, and there are reasons for this. So, and I don't know, there's an earlier version that must not have uploaded. So we have discourses here, discourses being both just actual speech that people use, but also kind of general assumptions of like what a person, ways of doing and being. So like in the book, I use figure skating. So people who know about skating know that, you know, the boots come separate from the blades. They know that, you know, if you go to a competition, you check. All of these things are behaviors, but there's also a language that go with them. So we have that theory running. We have language ideologies, which I know this word could look scary. Basically, it's just implicit beliefs people have about language, how language should be used, who should speak which language, what language should be taught where, what language should be spoken in society, whether or not people should learn a certain language to work in a certain context, et cetera. This comes into play in language policy, educational policy, all kinds of things. Language ideological debates. So basically, if there's a live debate in society about language ideology, something surrounding language. So in Canada, you have official bilingualism. You've got these language ideological debates surrounding whether or not the country should be officially bilingual, surrounding whether or not Anglophone children should learn French. All of these things are live debates in society. One way to tell if there's language ideological debates going on would be to look at the op-ed section, perhaps, of a paper or letters to the editor. Usually there's some public discourse or debate, blogs, things like that. You can pick them up there. We also take on neoliberal ideologies surrounding language education. Bluntly put, what can you get by learning a language? What will it do for you? Language, culture, and identity couplings and decouplings, and these are discursive. So this is where it comes, because people, there's really a common tendency for people to say, oh, language and culture are inherently linked. Well, we found an author, Karin Reisiga, she's Danish. She wrote a really, really interesting book in, I think, 2006 or 7. She's got two, and I get them confused. But she says, yes, like when you're talking about, like, kind of like Martin was talking about in environmental movements and trying to bring awareness to animals that are facing extinction, that will happen for languages as well. And so in language maintenance and language revitalization movements, of course, language and culture will be inherently linked, because that's part of how you convince people that the language is important to connect. So they think that that's an inherent coupling because people have used words to make it an inherent coupling, and that's what they're doing to market this coupling, essentially. It's just like a common belief that then is spread in society. But as it turns out, and identity, of course, is coupled right within that. If you lose your language, this is like Isabel is looking at Cajun culture, like if you lose your language, can you still be Cajun? That's kind of a live question among some sociolinguists, right? But as it turns out, you can also kind of decouple language and culture from your identity. And I think you guys probably do this every day. How many of you have a Duolingo app running right now? You don't have to say it all in yet. Yeah. Are you doing much culture in Duolingo? Not so much, unless you count pronunciation. But then you have to say, well, whose pronunciation am I being taught, right? Is it the standard? Then that's kind of like no one's pronunciation. Then we also engage with intercultural orientations to language education. We'll get to that towards the end, and also intercultural mediation. And we emphasize students' purposeful engagement in target language communities of practice, and we'll come to why that's important. So a bit of the roadmap, we talked a bit about our positionality and all of that. We'll move on. So our context, is New Brunswick, Canada, which is just north of the state of Maine. And it kind of sometimes is confusing for people because at least in the 80s, maps of the US kind of cut off at the state of Maine and they were just blue. So I've had some students before who thought that there was ocean there, but there is actually land. And this border was disputed pretty frequently between the state of Maine and New Brunswick. But there's New Brunswick, there's Nova Scotia. This was originally part of a colony called Acadie that was a French colony established in 1604, I believe. Then more specifically, we conducted our research here in Moncton, New Brunswick, and I left my notes here, very important. I was trying to do this quickly yesterday and I realized notes would be better. So here we go. New Brunswick is Canada's only officially bilingual province. This is also enshrined in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which is akin to Canada's constitution. Its population comprises about 32% Francophone or French speakers. Most of them are Acadian, but not all. 66% Anglophone or English speakers, and then 2% First Nation, mostly from Mi'kmaq backgrounds. Now, the Mi'kmaq language is not an official language, and that's something that is a live debate among scholars in New Brunswick, but we won't talk too much about it here. The Official Languages Act of New Brunswick was approved in 1969 before Canada's by a few months through the promotion of the province's first Acadian Premier, Louis Robichaud. We'll get to the details on the history behind this act in a moment, but we'd like to underscore that the official narrative of New Brunswick's bilingual policy is that it allows for individual choice regarding official language practices. Speak English, speak French. This is a graphic we found from an actually official ad. It's your choice. Duality in education. The Official Languages Act provides for separate school systems for Francophone and Anglophone children with strict admission policies. So the dual language programs that we have here in the US, half a day in Spanish, half a day in English, can't do that in New Brunswick, actually illegal. French-speaking kids are in their own schools, English-speaking kids are in their own schools. And this is also in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Beyond mere policy, it is enshrined as like federal law. Study of the other official language is required in both Francophone and Anglophone schools, with French immersion a popular option in Anglophone schools. Unlike other provinces you might have heard about where French immersion is kind of a boutique program, like the gifted kids line up to get into it, with competitive placement, in New Brunswick, provincial policy mandates that French immersion must be made available where there is sufficient demand. So if there's demand, they have to figure out a way to make it work. So this is kind of funny to do that and do the history backwards, but it kind of works. So some historical context regarding the implementation of bilingualism in the province has to do with the expulsion of the Acadians, also known as the Grand Dérangement or Great Upheaval, during the mid-1700s, during the 7 Years' War, during which thousands of Acadians were forcibly removed by the British Army. When they were allowed to return after the Treaty of Paris in 1763-64, they remained outside of political and economic influence for nearly 200 years. As part of a wider national movement in the 1960s for increased rights for Francophones, the province became officially bilingual, so that's the context. Where there have been incredible gains in the status of Acadian communities in the province, debates, language ideological debates between the official languages communities continue to flare up. For example, there is a segment of the Anglophone population that still agitates even for the elimination of official bilingualism. They're called the Anglophone Rights Association. That's an actual ad on an actual bus that someone took, I think, 2020. They argue that they're disadvantaged because the Official Languages Act requires bilingual competence for many jobs in the public sector. Wendy found us, I like that. So bilingualism in New Brunswick then encapsulates a bifurcated ideology informed by majority-minority linguistic relations. On the one hand, institutional bilingualism through the Official Languages Act provides linguistic equity for the historically marginalized Francophones through a languages right ideology. On the other hand, premised on a neoliberal languages resource ideology, the Official Languages Act has been presented to the Anglophone majority as individual bilingualism through French as a second language education, providing access to French and English bilingualism and opening the doors for economic capital. Opportunities will come to you by learning this language. It sounds kind of like a fortune cookie. And so when Wendy and I first started our project, we were thinking, okay, grade 3, that's what they say in Canada, 3rd grade is the entry point for French immersion. And so why don't we talk to teachers there? Because I was kind of coming from the anthropological socialization theory that if we're going to socialize children into like Francophone culture, maybe there'd be fun activities. We kind of see the beginnings of telling the kids why they're learning this language. So they'll like buy in, it'll hook them in, right? So we thought, we'll interview these teachers. Now you could say, well, that might have been a bad choice because they're trying to teach them the language so that they can actually do their courses in immersion. However, we also interviewed their principals. So we were invited into 9 different schools. We talked to 9 principals and 17 early French immersion teachers. Some of them were pairs, so they were co-teachers, and so they kind of talked and built their ideas together. We wanted to ask them about what they thought bilingualism was. So we had a quadrant. We're going to look at 2 of the quadrant cells in the book, which is what is bilingualism for, and or what is bilingualism, and then what is bilingualism for. And we also asked them about the cultural content in the French immersion program. Like, we found these documents, which I'll show you in a minute, or I'll show you kind of the chapter on them, but we analyzed these documents. We found like differing discourses in the documents, and we asked them to respond to them. So this is kind of how the book is set up. But no, we couldn't just keep it easy. As Wendy and I were talking, first of all, we kind of were like, where's the culture? Everybody keeps talking about the culture kind of being absent. This is strange. And we found an author first, Michelle Kohler out of Australia, talking about teachers as mediators in language education broadly. And we thought, well, that's interesting. She's talking about their ability to like decenter themselves from their primary culture and maybe the culture they're teaching. She looked at teachers of Bahasa Indonesian in Australia, so kind of difficult circumstances. One of them was actually married to a Muslim husband, but didn't really know how much she could talk about that in class. And so kind of like how culture and language and identity could be in class. So she worked with them and tried to get them to be able to talk about Indonesian culture in a way that kind of both represented their point of view, but was also respectful of the student's point of view. You could have kind of like a 3-way then, because the student's culture might not be the teacher's culture. Anyway, we were interested in that. But then the next year after our study, this thing dropped. So it's called the Douglas Fir Group Framework of Language Acquisition. And there was a group of applied linguists who got together a couple different times in the 2010s from all kinds of disciplines and tried to put together an ecological model of language acquisition that represented kind of everyone's discipline. So the fact that they actually were able to hammer out this article like in a room, and they did it in the Douglas Fir room of a hotel in Denver, which is why it's called that. But they got together, they found a draft, they put it together, they really liked it, but it's so big, hardly anyone has actually engaged with it. But Wendy and I were thinking, wait, when we saw this thing, like it fits so well with what we're doing. And then I had this crazy idea, hey, we should write a book, which took a while because it's a big model, right? There were about 20 applied linguists that were in here. So you have the macro level of ideological structures. So beliefs, values, religious views, things like that, that are the wider views in society. Then you've got the meso level of sociocultural institutions and communities, which you'll see here that schools are part of that. Then you've got the micro level of social activity, which would be where teachers are in interaction with their students, although it could be other kind of language instruction too. It doesn't have to be school. And then individuals engaging with language with each other. But they were clear in the article that they were centering this framework on the learner. So if you're looking at it and you're in teacher education, what's missing? The teacher. Where's the teacher? No teacher. Just the school. Well, we know schools are complex organizations, right? You've got the curriculum, you've got the principal, you've got teachers, you've got other teachers, you know, all kinds of stuff going on. There are no teachers here. So that's kind of what we ended up wanting to do with the book. Besides looking at this lack of cultural education, we decided to take this thing and overlay it on our research context. And we really made a mess. So where are the teachers? Wendy found this picture. Again, a lot of our funny pictures were from Wendy. Where are the teachers? Well, we found a couple of researchers who had talked about potential uses for this framework in teacher ed. There's another scholar, Patricia Duff, who talked all about ideologies within it. So if you can imagine, the framework is not actually 2-dimensional. It's supposed to be more spherical. And then ideologies in it actually run all the way through. So you've got these macro level ideologies affecting all of the levels of the framework. And that's what we were seeing in our data, and that's kind of what we ended up organizing the book on. So we ask in the book, which ideologies inform and are reproduced in New Brunswick's language ideological debates at the macro level? How have these ideologies been institutionalized at the meso level of educational policy? How are these ideologies represented in the discourse of administrators and teachers in French immersion education, who are representatives of meso-level educational institutions? What do educators' discourses reveal about their perspectives on English-French bilingualism and on the relationship between language culture and their students' identities within Francophone communities of practice? There's just two of us in this research team, so these are very large questions, and this is how we often felt as we tried to think through. Very much like that. We kind of use these different thoughts of like intercaler, it's a French verb for like braiding, weaving. It's just like, it's kind of a big mess when you're trying to tease it all out. Towards the end, then we felt a little bit more like this. Like just when we thought we had everything tied together, because we have like each chapter has its own argument and its own literature review. But then you've got the overall argument that you've got to tie in from the previous chapter to the next chapter, and then make sure at the end of the chapter that you tie it back into the main argument. So there's a lot going on. So the introduction is just, it's the literature review. In chapter 1, we introduced the study. So I'm picking it up here with chapter 2, where we look at the language ideological debates. And I give all credit to Wendy. She wrote this chapter on her sabbatical one year. She just wanted to get the historical context of French immersion down. So she went around New Brunswick and interviewed a lot of people. We ended up framing this chapter on nodal moments in French immersion education where language ideological debates popped up in society around French immersion education in New Brunswick. And what we found, again, was kind of like I said in the intro, that because the program had been framed to the Anglophone public as like, hey, you have a right, they took it to mean you have a right to be bilingual, which is not what the policy says. It's not what the law says. It says you have the right to use whichever official language you choose in government and like healthcare and things like that. But the English-speaking population took it to mean like, this is our constitutional right to become bilingual. And so a lot of the language ideological debates around immersion have had to do with that, or the efficacy of the program. So our children have a right to be bilingual, and this program is not making them bilingual, ergo, we're wasting money. So this is another debate that popped up again about 2 years ago. It just keeps circulating. So then moving to the meso level, we look at the responses, principals and teachers both, the responses to what is bilingualism. And we see, which is also kind of curious because they were working with cognitive linguists on their training, but they kind of had this idea that, okay, like language is like a code. We're going to install it in your head like the packet in Word, and then you will have French. But then if you want to toggle over and put the English packet on, you can do that. So this idea of, and Wendy did a lot of work on this, the neoliberal ideologies of language education, even if they're looking at cognitive perspectives, which are more advanced, still are just like, can you do this or can you not do this with the language? Can you flip that switch? Whereas if you look at socially situated theories of bilingualism, then bilingualism is fluid. I think of my colleagues' research on fused lex and American Spanish-English speakers' speech. And so this is kind of more of the common trend in the field. However, I mean, you still see that these are out there. Those are pretty recent texts. So the teachers and principals, importantly, the administrators of these schools still were thinking, okay, we just need to get the kids using French. That's our goal. So then we asked them, what is bilingualism for? And the most common answer was opportunities, which is like, how do you get the public to buy into this program if you want them to send their kids to immersion? Just say opportunities, because that's like really vague, right? Well, cool, opportunities. Sometimes the next common thing would be jobs. So if you want a federal job or a government job at provincial level, either way, in Canada or in New Brunswick, you don't have to be bilingual, but a lot of the job postings ask for it. So you have more opportunities for work. We coded our data several times, but we realized that it overlaid really well with Bourdieu's constructs of capital, so symbolic opportunities. Random capital can be transformed into other kinds of capital. Economic, that's pretty straightforward. Social capital would be the expansion of one's social networks. And then cultural could be education. It could be the big C culture we like to think of that we'll hear in a moment. I like that. Also stay for the chamber music, which will be at noon. Yeah, French chamber music would be kind of your big C capital if you had access to that through language. And so mostly, and kind of unsurprisingly, social capital and cultural capital were much less referenced by the teachers and principals about what bilingualism is for, at least for the students. They often blamed the parents, not blamed, but they'd say, well, the parents think, but then they would push against it. And so we ended up using Bakhtin's ideological becoming because you could hear them say, but wouldn't it be great if my students would understand more about my culture and language and like what I do at home and when I speak French and what it's like to be in my family speaking French. So they kind of accepted the top-down discourse, which you would expect teachers to do as representatives of the educational institution. You know, they're trying to do what they think the principals want them to do. So that's kind of, but all the way through neoliberalism, learn language to get stuff was very much the prevalent discourse. So we then did a discourse analysis on 2 documents that we had the teachers look at excerpts of. So the first one's a policy document from the Francophone district, which has a very clear coupling of language, cultural, and identity for the Francophone kids, because this is a linguistic revitalization, language maintenance movement. And so they very much are afraid of the language disappearing, of their kids turning to Anglophone culture. A lot of Acadians have moved to Alberta because there are a lot of jobs out there. Actually east of us. But it's, yeah, they're leaving and joining Anglophone culture because there are more economic opportunities. And so they're trying to do this in the schools, but there is kind of problematic issue too with recent migration. Not all of the Francophones there are Acadian. And so some of them are like, hey, wait, I don't even, like, why are you trying to teach me this culture? It's not even mine. So there's that going on. My colleagues have been looking at it. But they're coupled, they're inherently coupled, as one would expect in a cultural development policy, right? But in the immersion document, the only time we looked through all of the curriculum documents, the only time we saw culture mentioned was in the Language Arts Foundation document, which frames all of the language arts curriculum from grade 12 all the way down. Acadians were never mentioned at all. And we see discursive coupling of French language and Francophone cultures, like as coupled to the global Francophone community. So they don't mention Canada's history, which is also we thought was interesting. They don't mention local history. They're just like, well, if you learn French, that will help you engage with global culture. It will help you understand and be able to communicate effectively with people. But it's decoupled from the French immersion students' identity. So there's actually a phrase we had them reflect on, which is the goal of French immersion is not to have students adopt Francophone culture, but to have them appreciate it. So you see this very clear kind of othering where learning French is not going to change you, really, except to give you the information that you need to be able to communicate effectively. What can you get from your communication? So it's still very much a commodification of language that you see. So then it gets fun. I think this is my favorite chapter. I took the lead on this one. We had our first article in 2018. We prefaced this chapter with those teachers. We summed it up, but basically it gets kind of confusing. They're like, yeah, like, so most of the teachers are Francophone and they talk about how much their culture means to them and their language, and they really just love it. But then when they get to talking about their students, they're like, yeah, we don't do a lot of culture. I guess we should do more culture. I'm not really sure how much we're allowed to do. One of them told us, like, well, it's not a religion or something. Another one said, well, if we lose time, if we run out of time, the French gonna get the kick. That's one of my favorite quotes. culture was not prefaced. It was not an intercultural orientation driving the framework of the curriculum at that point in time. In fact, it wasn't even under consideration, and the principals certainly also, well, okay, maybe the teachers just don't know. The principals, one of them straight up told us like, oh no, culture is not a focus of this program. Another one said, step away from the culture. And another one told us it was, and I don't know if any of you play cricket, but she told us it was a sticky wicket, which is, you know, a conundrum kind of thing. So, oh no, French was not framed in culture, the people who talked about it the most were ones who had like basically no clue about Acadian culture or what had happened, even though they grew up in the maritime provinces. So they're very particular and kind of interesting. And one principal said kind of offensive things where I had oh yes, many thanks to Isabel Lindstrom for doing the copy editing on the first draft of this, but the first time she read one chapter, she dropped a comment into us going with the emoji because what the principal said was so shocking. And so then we created our course for our Fulbright. And so we look at the implications on language teacher education. We took this intercultural mediation theory from Michelle Kohler and inspiration also by those that she works with, Tony Liticote and Angela Scarvino. And we created a course because what Michelle had argued for in her book was that in teacher training programs, there should actually be a course in which you kind of discuss intercultural mediation, not just like what is it, but like how do you do it? How do you enter into this difficult space? And how do you tread this kind of water in a way where like, okay, when you're talking about the deportation of the Acadian people and like killing of them and like some of them came back, it's like, okay, you kind of understand why the teachers wouldn't want to bring that up, especially in third grade, right? But when these kids went all the way through the immersion program until high school and they never really heard about it, they hardly had any culture at all, except when the social studies curriculum did the history of New Brunswick, and that was in English. So very, very interesting. So we designed the course. We actually include some data from the 2020 offering of the course, which was online. So that actually turned out to be fortuitous because we got some really, really great conversations that shows the students entering into this intercultural mediation where I had framed it with them for, you know, the previous course sessions, and I kind of just stepped back and let them talk. And so we're very excited. We have very little so far published on that data. That's kind of next projects. So to end, and this is kind of, we're curious to see how people in the field will react, but we kind of humbly suggest that we might be able to put teachers somewhere in here. And we aren't allowed by our copyright permission from John Wiley to modify it, so we had to do that. So we're saying that teachers could be placed as intercultural mediators, kind of in between the meso and micro levels as conduits of those ideologies, and hopefully being able to translate some of what's going on in society down so that their students might be able to think through it. Okay, so I ask my students all the time, like, what's the so what question? Great. Great, that's a lot of words. So what? Language, I don't know if it has ever quite been so commodified as it is today. People think, oh, I'm going to travel to random country. I'll just take Google Translate with me and it will help. Okay, we kind of forget the important thing, which is that languages are peopled. That's what Tony Liticote says. We really like that. You know, if you're just picking up the language for fun, that's cool. But there are also people who speak the language. And when you come, like the Acadians, in a case where the majority is learning the minority's language, it's really dicey to say that the linguistic majority is gaining capital. I don't know if that, how do you deal with that, right? You really need to think about some way to do it ethically and putting people back in the loop, as we talked about at our conference. So we advocate for a pedagogical stance centered on intercultural mediation, challenging the neoliberal framing of language education and valuing the people's nature of languages. So un grand merci. I'd like to, oh, well. I'd like to, before questions, thank, first of all, my husband Mason for supporting me through the writing. It's been a long process, and he's been there every step of the way. Thank you to Katie Carr and Ian Ermitinger-Salas for their like unfailing. We've looked for funding so many times. Yeah, they've been amazing. And generally the Vice President's office, my ISL colleagues. Yeah, I'm just really grateful to be able to work here, and also at an institution which has valued my work with Wendy. And Wendy is also greatly appreciative as well. So thank you. And there we are.
Good, thank you. So we have time for a couple of questions.
Sorry, I went long. Yeah, true.
Merci, Kelly.
Merci.
So I have a question, a
Mhm.
big one. And were the interviews conducted in English or French? And was the language the professionally stronger language for the teacher or personally stronger language for the teachers?
Okay, so Wendy, first of all, doesn't speak French, but they were Anglophone schools, and so they had to have, the district required them to have a certain level of English to be able to work in the schools. So their language of work outside of the classroom was English. The language in the classroom was French. We had one teacher want us to meet. So some of these topics were so contentious that some teachers didn't do it. One of them asked to meet her in a cafe so that she wasn't in her school. She ended up switching into French for most of the interview because we were kind of, I think, in an Anglophone part of town too. So, but another one switched for a bit, but most of the interviews were in English, yeah.
Could I have a follow-up just quick? Do you think that affected the content or the elaboration they gave you on the answers?
In fact, we think it might have helped because they were talking about, especially what is bilingualism, and for the teachers, well, the principals were mostly Anglophones. Some of them said they weren't bilingual, so this is another issue if you've got a person saying they're not bilingual as the principal of a school offering immersion. Yeah, so they were very frank. Very, very frank. As much as they felt safe, some of them would, like, they give us the official line, but then they would often push back against it at a different point. Well, yeah, that's kind of the case, but, and we have a couple of good but moments in the data in the book, yeah. Mm-hmm.
All right,
Sorry.
time for maybe one more question.
I can just project my voice. Kelly, I really appreciated your talk. It's so fascinating where you're going with all of this. You brought up Pierre Bourdieu, and I love me some Pierre Bourdieu. When you were talking about the power and cultural capital, it brought to mind another of his works on habitus, on field. And so I was thinking while you were going through this about the importance of when our students, for example, are learning another language, that they're entering a new field and they're creating a standing for themselves in that field.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you say this construction of how we do foreign language acquisition stresses this is a skill for a future job, the same way you put Excel at the bottom of your CV, like I have Excel skills, I have Microsoft Office skills, and then you say your language skills, it really commodifies and takes away any cultural element to your language ability. But when you say I am a person who is within this field of being a bilingual speaker of another language, that I may be a beginner, I may be a novice in this, but this is part of this new identity that I'm building, and I'm working to grow into this new into this culture. I find that so powerful. So I really appreciate what you were saying there, and I'd love to see some more habitus in all of this.
Oh yeah.
That's so good.
Oh yeah.
Thank you, Kelly.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, my students can. So part of the Fulbright is that you're supposed to bring part of what you did there and translate it into your curriculum here. And so students, does that kind of sound familiar? A little bit, yeah. We do a lot of that, yeah. So it's not just what do I get from this language, but the important question is who am I, or who is this language enabling me to be or grow to be? And yeah, so that's kind of what whether or not you want to say, okay, maybe they don't want to become Francophone, that's understandable in society, but learning should always change you in some way, right? It doesn't make sense if you're going to learn something, it doesn't change you at all. So just to create that meta discussion. Our favorite was one teacher, and then I'll stop, but she was the first teacher we interviewed, and we inspired her so much. She had been a music teacher And so we came and observed her later that week, and she put together this free period activity where her students had created a We Love Bilingualism song, and they had filmed a video, and they were so excited to show it to us. And so just putting that idea out there, she was like, of course, this is amazing. Why has no one talked about this? So I think part of it was just introducing the idea also really was kind of good. So I thank you all again for your support. I know it's been a long road with this thing, but I really, really appreciate it. And thank you all for coming.
Let's give both our authors a round of applause. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, both books did such an interesting job bringing together ways that we can rethink our relationship to each other, to the cultures around us, as well as to the world, the natural world. So thank you. They also gave us 2 books to add to your Christmas wish list. So hopefully you got those titles down, ready to go. I also want to thank you all for joining us here today. I really appreciate it. And Jeff has a quick announcement.
So thank you again all for coming. Dr. Marshall mentioned at noon, so in about 30 minutes, we're having our first in our series of chamber music at noon in Payson. I'd like to invite you all to come back. We're going to have croissants from Le Café de la Plage in Malibu, and continuing on the French theme. The topic of the music is French Impressionism. Hope to see you in about 30 minutes.
And there are refreshments, free refreshments in the back here. So please help yourselves. Thank you.